The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll the stone for us away from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "No, don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. So now you and Bunny have heard the story at the center of our celebration today and at the center of our faith. Well, you know, the biggest worry that Mary Magdalene and those other women had as they approached the tomb early that Sunday morning was how they were going to get in. They had everything else prepared. They'd watched carefully as Jesus was taken down from the cross, so they'd easily be able to find again the stone cave where they laid his body. They'd gathered carefully the spices and ointments needed to honor Jesus' body after death. And then they'd waited patiently for sunrise to mark the end of Sabbath rest, ensuring that their morning rituals would be good and proper. They were prepared for all of that. There was one thing they were wondering about, though. Who would move the giant stone used to seal the tomb's entrance shut? They talked about it on the way there. Well, maybe if we all push together in the same direction, or maybe there will be a groundskeeper we can find to help us. Or maybe one of those big, strong fishermen always hanging around Jesus will also happen to arrive and he can move it. It was the one thing they weren't prepared for. How would they get into the sealed tomb in order to treat Jesus' body? Well, as it turns out, they needn't have worried. On two accounts. The first one being that the tomb was already open by the time they got there. And the second being that Jesus' body wasn't there to anoint anyway. Someone was there, an unnamed teenager in a robe. "Don't be alarmed," he says. "You've got the right tomb, but the wrong idea. Jesus isn't here because Jesus isn't dead. Not anymore." No, in fact, not only was Jesus not there, he had already hit the road. He was on the way back to Galilee, his home region in the north, a few days' travel away. "Oh, he just wanted to get a head start," the teenager says. "He'll just meet you there." Well, all the things that the women had prepared for, they certainly had not prepared for this. They were amazed and terrified, and they fled the place, saying nothing to anyone. As they had walked to the tomb that morning, do you remember what they'd been talking about? Their most pressing concern? The big stone. Do you think that's what they were still talking about as they went away from the tomb? I don't. Sometimes the one thing we're worried about, the one thing we think we can't solve, can't accomplish, the one boulder we think we cannot move, sometimes God has already figured that one out, even while we're still worrying about it and talking about it. Sometimes what seems like the unmovable obstacle isn't really the obstacle at all. But then again, sometimes God answers that one question that we think is most important and then just replaces it with a whole host of other questions we have no idea how to even begin to answer. That question, who will move the stone, might no longer have been front of mind for those Galilean women, but I imagine a whole lot of other questions had suddenly moved to the top of their list. Questions they hadn't even imagined were possible to ask 5 minutes before they got to that tomb. For instance, who was that mysterious messenger? And maybe most central, how was Jesus possibly dead for days and then alive again? Not only alive, but healthy enough to travel for hundreds of miles alone. And speaking of that, why couldn't Jesus have waited a little bit? Did he think no one would come for him? Did he not want to stick around to tell his closest friends he was alive again? It was barely sunrise. How early a start could he have gotten? What's so important that he had to get back to Galilee right away? Well, these questions and more might have filled the minds of these women as they fled from that tomb. Big stone entirely forgotten. Mark, the writer of this gospel, just leaves the story there. We, the readers, never get the answers to those questions, although I imagine those faithful women did eventually catch up with the risen Jesus in Galilee and get to hear what he had to say. But Mark ends the story so abruptly, almost inconclusively, with the women's mixture of terror and amazement and all those unanswered questions. Perhaps that's because resurrection isn't really an ending. Perhaps Mark doesn't want us to think the story has concluded when it's really just begun. The risen Jesus is off to Galilee, the place where he first began his ministry, as though he's going back to the start, to do it all again, to heal again, to preach again, to multiply those loaves and fishes again. Jesus has been crucified, died, buried, conquered the power of sin and death, and came to be alive anew. And after all of that, resurrection has simply sent him back out in mission to serve some more. And anyone who wants to follow Jesus, to be a part of his ministry, had better get moving. They're already behind. Christ is already out there ahead of them, ready to get back to work. Of course, Jesus doesn't just go relive his ministry again. After a few weeks, the risen Jesus returns back to God's full presence in eternity. His time on earth is done. He is returning to heaven. It's his people, his followers, who are the ones called to take up the mantle, to continue his ministry, to go out and love and serve like Jesus. His resurrection was meant to be for them not an ending, but a new beginning. God had moved the stone. God had moved the stone. That wasn't the obstacle, although that was what the women had been most worried about. Still, stone moved, there were still plenty of challenges ahead of those disciples. How would they carry on Jesus' ministry in his absence? How would they live into the radical promises of resurrection now made real? They had been so prepared to anoint Jesus' body, but as it turns out, that wasn't the task before them at all. The task was to go out and share the gospel. No spices or oils needed. I imagine those women just had to hurry back to where they were staying in Jerusalem, set aside all those burial ointments they had just gathered, and pack their bags instead. Hit the road to Galilee. Mark says the women fled the tomb afraid to say anything to anyone, but they obviously didn't stay that way. To start with, they were charged with telling the other disciples to go to Galilee, which clearly they did. We read from the book of Acts this morning the disciple Peter's words about how he did get to encounter the risen Jesus, presumably because those women told him where to find him. The story of Jesus' resurrection has come down all these years, even to us here today. Someone clearly talked about it. It didn't stay in the silence. Now, that does not mean, though, that those women didn't still have that initial terror that had driven them from the tomb. It just means the amazement they also had outweighed their terror. They were terrified and amazed, both. They leaned into that amazement and went out to share this good news of resurrection as soon as they could, even while they were still scared and full of all those unanswerable questions. But that's all ahead of us, isn't it? We are here at Easter morning. We are here at the empty tomb. We are here in the silence of terror and amazement. And today, we are given that same choice that those women were. Will we go out to share the good news? Will we go back to Galilee, so to speak, to take up the mission and ministry of Christ ourselves? When we read Mark's gospel, Easter Sunday doesn't come as a conclusion so much as an invitation to new beginning. Jesus has been changed by resurrection. Will we let ourselves be transformed as well? Will we leave the wild implications of this death-defying Savior in the silence? Or will we let them speak loudly through our words and actions, despite any fear or confusion we still have? Will we really believe that we are free from sin, that we can drop our guilt and commit our energy to love instead? Will we believe that death has been swallowed up forever, that we need not be afraid even as we stare it in the face, because God's promise of life beyond is so sure? I hope we will. I hope we will stop worrying about the stones God has already moved. I hope we will set aside the burial oils we've gathered. This moment is not about death. This moment is not an ending. It's a new beginning, a call to action. Pack your bags and get going. The world needs this good news about resurrection, and it is ours to share. New life has come, and it is changing everything. Let's go.